Hello, I'm Caroline Derby, 19th Countess of Derby, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be presenting the new episode on Duchess the podcast, which is devoted to the Earls and Countesses of Derby and Knowsley Hall. And I've had an overwhelming response and request to show the treasures on Instagram that I have been finding over the last 30 years. And this is another one. So to help me with the storytelling, I've got Dr Stephen Lloyd, because he's actually found a lot of these discoveries with me. And this is a little bit confusing because our local town here is called Prescott. The person who brought this to our attention is called Prescott, and the person who actually kept these relics of the 7th Earl of Derby is called Prescott. So Stephen will unravel all of that for us.
So just before COVID, this gentleman, Mr. Prescott, came in, the descendant of the yeoman who attended the 7th Earl of Derby on the scaffold at Bolton before he was to be beheaded on the 15th of October 1651, so right at the end of the Civil War, and he was one of the last people to be executed in England. He really was an ardent royalist, and so Parliament and Cromwell really had to remove him from the scene. It was very brutal. So he waited on the scaffold in the marketplace of Bolton with his loyal attendant, William Prescott, who was a yeoman from near Wigan. And before he knelt on the block to be beheaded, he gave some of his clothing to his faithful attendant, William Prescott. So we have this great photograph from the 1870s, so it's 150 years old. So we have these two beautiful leather gauntlets, which actually have survived in the Prescott family. We were able to have them restored and exhibited here last year. The very fine linen collar with these tassels hanging down that he wore, still with food and wine stains from his last meal at the pub at the Old Man and Scythe in Bolton, still standing. And his leather skull cap here, which is actually in black leather. And one of his brass spurs has survived. And this object here, which is a detail here, is an IOU from the 7th Earl of Derby to William Prescott, who promises to repay a loan of £50, which is signed by the Countess Charlotte, wife of the Earl, and that would be about £5,000 today. And this little object here, the right at the front, just here, you can see this little object here. This is literally a chip off the old block. This is a relic from the wooden block of the scaffold where the 7th Earl was executed. So these are the relics of the 7th Earl of Derby.
And we should probably explain what this book is, because the reason why we can authenticate everything is because we have these incredible archives here. So this book is Lady Constance's book. And it shows all the things that she treasured and were on display. She actually made this scrapbook. And that's really helped to authenticate and identify this, because this has just actually been on the Antiques Roadshow and lots of people got very excited about it. But to tie in with these actual relics of his clothes, we have a rather gruesome stool here. And this is the stool that he sat on before he put his head on the block and was executed. And then so this is all displayed together in Knowsley Hall nowadays. And then this is the 7th Earl himself. Tell us about what's going on around the portrait, what it actually says.
Well, the portrait itself is about 1636, signed and dated. It's by Cornelius Johnson, who was a portrait working at the Stuart Court in London, contemporary with Sir Anthony van Dyck. It shows the 7th Earl as a cultured man, a courtier. He was a high church Anglican, so he was a serious, pious man, and then wasn't really suited for fighting all these terrible battles in Lancashire during the Civil War. And so this, after he was executed, there was he was known as the Martyr Earl by royalists. And so in the early 20th century, this extraordinary fireplace and overmantel was created by the 17th Earl, just before the First World War. He was a great friend of the royal family, and they came to stay here regularly. And this, in a way, was a reminder to the royal family, King George V and Queen Mary, of the extraordinary loyalty of the Stanley family, the Earls of Derby. So what it is it's the Stanley heraldic supporters, so the griffin and the stag pulling aside, as if they are pulling aside, it's a giltwood frame surround, putting aside a curtain to reveal the martyr Earl, with his titles on the one side and the description of the execution on the other side. But this is in the style of Inigo Jones, who was the great court architect at the court of King Charles I, and below it is a copy of a Vanbrugh fireplace from Bolton Castle in the Midlands. So it's what you might call a mashup, really, but it's 17th century in inspiration.
So this is the 7th Countess, Charlotte de la Trémouille, and when her husband, James, the 7th Earl, was over in the Isles of Man protecting his lands over there, she protected the Stanley lands here in Lancashire. So just tell us how long that went on for.
Well, there were two great sieges. The most famous siege is the first one, 1644. So we're talking about a great Stanley fortified house, a great castle with an eagle tower with 16 towers around it on rising ground, about 10 miles north of Knowsley, overlooking the Irish Sea. So huge strategic, Latham House, huge strategic importance. Now she's left in charge of defending this great house with 300 of her retainers, her steward and her retainers, and local troops. She's up against a parliamentarian army of thousands, and she withstands the siege that lasts 4 months as General Ireton, one of the leading parliamentarian commanders, and she becomes famous and notorious for her formidable qualities, her extraordinary resistance, both verbally through letters. She does not compromise, she does not surrender, and eventually she withstands the siege when Prince Rupert of the Rhine comes over from Yorkshire with his troops and relieves the siege.
So just like Lady Margaret Beaufort, she's an extraordinary woman within the family.
I mean, sadly, the next year the parliamentarians coming back because the royalists are losing the civil war all over the country and in Lancashire, and they take the house, the great fortified house, and they destroy it. So there's nothing left of the original Latham house or castle now. So, and she does survive. She does go on to the Isle of Man with her daughters, where she rejoins her husband, and then they do hold out on the Isle of Man till 1651. So right at the end of the Civil War.
And then he's executed. So I hope these little snippets entice you to listen to the podcast itself, because I'm talking about formidable women and extraordinarily important men. So here we have the 7th Countess, who defended her family homes for 1,000 days, and then we have her husband there, who lost his head in defence of the crown. It's all part of the history of the Stanley family over the last 600 years.